Our second section is much shorter. We've had Hadad in the south. Now we're going to go to Rizon in the north.
Vayakem Elohim lo Satan.
Vayakem Elohim lo Satan. Okay, almost exactly the same as what we had before. Before it was Adonai, it was Yahweh. Now we have Elohim, and before it said Lishlomo. Well, we know the context, so we know it's to Solomon. So God raised up, Hifil again, for him, for Solomon, a Satan, okay, a second Satan.
Et Rezon ben Eliada.
Who is that Satan this time? Now it's Et Rezon ben Eliada, okay? His name is Rezon, and he's the son of Eliada. God knows, something like that.
Asher barach me'et Hadad Ezer.
Asher barach me'et Hadad Ezer, who had fled from Hadad Ezer,
Melech Tzova Adonav.
Melech Tzova Adonav. Hadad Ezer was the king of Tzova, and he was his lord, his master. We're going to look in a moment. The map. We'll see where Tzova is. He's fleeing. So both Hadad had to flee and Rizon had to flee. The Satans that God was raising up are people that were under stress themselves. Okay, our second Satan is Rizon. Let's look at a map. So we see here it's Satan Rizon ben Eliada, who was the king. Sorry, that was his father. Eliada was his father. The king's name, Hadad Ezer. Don't mix up this Hadad with the other Hadad. This is Hadad Ezer. Baal or Hadad helps. Ezer is to help, I believe, like Ezra, yeah. And he's from Tzova, king of Tzova. So here's Zobah, Tzova, okay? This is the north. We got Galilee here. We got Dan, the far northern part of Israel. We have Aram Damascus, the Arameans from Damascus. And Zobah is just off to the side here, a valley. So this guy, Hadad Ezer, is king there. Rizon is one of his servants, not a son. He works for him. He's a military guy probably. And he flees from Hadad. Okay, next verse. Okay, so he's fleeing from Hadad Ezer.
Vayikbotz alav anashim.
Vayikbotz an alav anashim, and he gathered to himself men, kind of like the other Hadad. Although the other Hadad did that for the purpose of finding a way through Paran, but he did have men with him, so he's got a group. So he gathers to himself men.
Vayehi sar gedud.
Vayehi sar gedud, and he was the captain of a gedud. A gedud is a marauding band, a group of men, kind of like mercenaries or freedom fighters or terrorists, it depends on which side you're on, that have no fixed address. They're running around, they're in hiding, and they are raiding. Well, I shouldn't say they're always terrorists or freedom fighters or whatever, because Naaman will lead Gedudim from Syria, from Aram Damascus, down into Israel later. So it's a group of men that are of fighting men. So Vayhi sar gedud, and he was the captain of a gedud.
Baharog David otam.
Baharog David otam, when David was haraging them, when David was slaughtering them. Okay, so this happened at the time when David was up in that area, at Damascus and at Tzova.
Vayelechu Damasek.
Vayelechu Damasek, and they went to Damascus.
Vayeshvuva.
Vayeshvuva, and they lived there.
Vayimlechu bedamasek.
Vayimlechu bedamasek, and they reigned. Actually, it's plural. And they reigned. They took over bedamasek. They took over Damascus. Here it's in pause. Damasek becomes Damasek. Okay. So he flees. He gathers some men around him. He has a gedud. He does this at the time of David, when David was there, so before Solomon. And he goes to Damascus at some point. He lives there, and he becomes king there. Here we have our map again. So here's Damascus, very close to Zobah, right? So he goes, he lives there, he goes to Damascus, he lives there, and he becomes king there. I just want to read briefly in English the account of David being in that area. So it says here that this happened when David was slaughtering them. That's when he fled and gathered himself these men. And we see on the map, David attacks Hadadezer, king of Zobah. So our atlas is telling us that this was, suggested route. David was up here expanding the kingdom. During David's era, the kingdom was expanding. During Solomon's era, the kingdom was contracting. And so during the time of David, he went up here, he attacked Damascus, he took over there, he set up, as we'll see in a moment, fortifications or people there to take control of it. And he goes up here to Zobah. And that's talked about in 1 Samuel 8. So David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehov, king of Zobah, that's our region here, as he went to restore his power at the river Euphrates. So he was really expanding his kingdom all the way up to Euphrates, to the northern part here. And David took from him 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers, and David hamstrung all the chariot horses, but left enough for 100 chariots. War is cruel, even cruel to animals. And when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, okay, so the Arameans, the Syrians from Damascus, came to help Zobah. What happened? David struck down 22,000 men of the Syrians. So it seems he was up here dealing with them. Damascus comes to help. David attacks them. Then David put garrisons in Aram of Damascus. He put fortifications there. And the Syrians became servants to David. Okay? So during David's time, the Syrians were subject to Israel and brought tribute. He got taxes from them. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. Okay? A clear narratorial statement of blessing to Israel during the time of David in the form of military victory. Verse 7. And so we need to contrast that with what's going on with Solomon, of course. And David took the shields of gold that were carried by the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem, right? Typical thing. The victor gets the spoils, takes it back to his place. And from Betah, wherever that is, and from Berotai, you see that here on the map, cities of Hadadezer, King David took very much bronze. So he got all kinds of spoil. David's in charge. Now, Hadad's story that we read earlier parallels Moses' story. Rizon's story parallels David's story. Jerome Walsh points this out nicely. Rizon, I'm saying this in Hebrew, Rezon, I guess, in English. Rizon is originally the servant of a king and not of royal blood himself. Okay, he wasn't the son of the king; he was working for the king. He was probably military, just like David was Saul's armor bearer. David was a shepherd in the line of Jesse, right? He wasn't a Benjamite. Like David, Rezon becomes the leader of a band of outlaws. David was running around with a gadood. Rezon is running around with a gadood. And with them eventually captures the city that is to become his capital. Okay, David took the Jebusite city, Jerusalem, and became his capital. Rezon takes Damascus, becomes his capital. And like David, Rezon becomes a king. They both reign in their city. So significant parallels with David, and these are included in our account, and also we learn a little bit from 1 Samuel 8. So during the reign of Solomon, Rezon takes over Damascus in the north, and Hadad comes back to Edom in the south. Okay? So we got a Satan in the north and a Satan in the south. David had controlled both of these regions. Joab was in the south, and he had control of Edom, and David was up here in the north. Under Solomon, the kingdom is shrinking, and his enemies are starting to surround him. I wrote something funny here. And all of this was instituted by God, as he was the one who established these two as Satans. He's the one who raised them up. Why did God send these Satans? Because of Solomon's idolatry. All those wives, all the gods that he brought in. He brought them even right into Jerusalem, or just next to Jerusalem there, and all kinds of idolatry was happening. So this is God set these up as discipline. And that goes back to the Davidic covenant. 2 Samuel 7. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. These satans are God's rod of men, his stripes of the sons of men. And the narrator tells us this directly, that God was doing this. We saw this already. Vayakem Adonai Satan, Vayakem Elohim lo Satan. Okay. And these accounts of these two Satans reinforces that God had established them. Okay. We see, just as he has established Moses and David. So this linkage, making us think about Rezon in terms of David and Hadad in terms of Moses, reestablishes or establishes that God had picked them and set them up and organized all this just as much as he had organized and set up David and Moses. Jerome Walsh states this well. He writes well, not just has good insight. The effect of this heaping up of the parallels is to recall that both Moses and David's careers were divinely directed, and thereby to intensify considerably the impact of the claim that God raised up Hadad and Rezon. The Bible could tell us everything it needed to say with propositional statements, right? God did this, God did that. No story, no narrative. When you add the stories, what it does, he says here, is it intensifies considerably the impact that God, in fact, had raised them up. God works in history. These are real events. And when you see what God did and how he did it, and the narrator and the authors write it for us so we make the connection, then we get a much fuller sense of the truth of God that he's trying to tell us. And because it's a narrative, we can identify with it in a way that we couldn't if it was just straight propositional text. The Bible is not systematic theology. You can get systematic theology from the Bible, and you should, for sure. But it's written in such a way that we can enter the story and we can see ourselves in various aspects. The same Yahweh who raised up Moses as Israel's savior, the same God who raised up David to be Israel's ideal king, now raises up adversaries to oppose Solomon. The punishment of Solomon and the impending disintegration of his empire became part of the sacred history of Yahweh's dealings with Israel, on par in importance with the Exodus and the covenant with David. Okay, strong statement. Not only God's blessings are important, but God's discipline is important. Our final verse.
ויהי שטן לישראל כל ימי שלמה.
Vayhi Satan LeYisrael Kol Yemei Shlomo. And it was, and it happened, a Satan, actually it's not and it happened, and he was. Often Vayhi just sets up in the past, and an event in the past. Here it's, and he was, and a opposer, an adversary for Israel all the days of Solomon. Okay, so let's talk about Rezon. Rezon was an adversary of Solomon all his days. So it happened early, even if he didn't take Damascus right away. Not clear when exactly he took Damascus because David had control of it. But at some point he did, and he was an adversary for Solomon all the days of Solomon.
ואת הרעה אשר הדד.
Ve'et hara'ah asher hadad, and the mischief, the trouble, which was Hadad's, which Hadad did. Okay, so we have the opposition of Rezon in the north, and also the opposition of Hadad, or it's like Rezon's opposition was similar to Hadad's opposition, linking them.
ויקוץ בישראל.
Vayakotz b'Yisrael. This is to loathe. The noun, there's a noun based on this root, which the very first occurrence, I just noticed this, is thorn in Genesis 3, thorns and thistles. So it's kind of like he was a thorn. He loathed Israel. Rizon did.
וימלוך על ארם.
Vayimloch al Aram. And he ruled over Aram. We have two Satans. Rizon in the north, Hadad in the south. And the way the story goes, we hear about this one first. Now, in 1 Kings 5, okay, that was our last verse in our text, not the last verse in the whole video, in our whole session here. In 1 Kings 5, we read that Solomon had said, Solomon says, V'ata heniach Adonai Elohai li misaviv. And now, V'ata heniach Adonai, so Yahweh, my God, Elohai, Yahweh, my God, has given me rest. This is like Noah, the man who gives rest and gives relief. So heniach is to give rest. So, and now, Yahweh, my God, has given rest to me, li, mesaviv. So he's saying, I have rest from all the people surrounding me. And what does he say? Ein Satan. There is no Satan. There is no adversary. In 1 Kings 5, he's saying he has no adversaries that surround him. Ve'ein pega ra. And no evil occurrence. In the books of the Kings, both 1st and 2nd Kings, Satan appears only in our chapter 11, the 3 times, 14 and whatever verse it was where he establishes, or he raises up, and then with that summary statement, that's the only 3 places, and then this verse in 1 Kings 5. So it's significant. We only got 4 occurrences to connect these two. Back in chapter 5, he says he had no Satan. No adversaries in chapter 5, according to Solomon. By chapter 11, we discovered that there have been 2 adversaries, and really all along. So I don't know if Solomon was bragging or he was discounting these guys, or he wasn't aware yet when he said this, not clear. So in chapter 11, we discover there have been 2 adversaries, which is God's discipline, and with another still to come, that being Jeroboam. He won't be called a Satan, but clearly he'll be an adversary. Kogan says it this way: the 2 tales of rebellion by foreigners, Hadad and Rizon are both foreigners, who tore at the kingdom from without, our 2 Satans, they introduce and amplify the rebellion of Jeroboam, who eventually succeeded in rendering the nation of Israel from within. So the one that actually splits the nation is going to be Jeroboam. And we'll read that shortly in our next video, I guess, as we get to it. And these 2 stories of these external guys, these 2 Satans, build up to what is going to happen with Jeroboam. So what is our lesson? This is where I'm going to end, okay? What is the lesson for Solomon? Is the lesson that God has kicked him out of the covenant? Okay, he's done this evil. He's brought all these idols in here, all this idol worship, and God's had enough. And so he's sending these Satans and Jeroboam. No, it's not that he's kicked him out of the covenant. The lesson is, these are my words, that the Lord disciplines those with whom he is bound in covenant. He's not kicking him out of the covenant. He is disciplining those with whom God is bound in covenant. He binds himself to Solomon in covenant. What is the lesson for us the readers? The Lord disciplines those with whom he is bound in covenant. It's the same lesson, okay? So we can see ourselves in the story of Solomon. We should see ourselves in the story of Solomon. Hebrews 12. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? Quote, my son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. God disciplines the people that he loves. He disciplines his children, okay? This is the quote. What is this quoted from? It's Proverbs chapter 3. And who wrote Proverbs? The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Okay? Interesting, ironic, fitting that the book of Hebrews is going to quote, for discipline, is going to quote the words of Solomon from Proverbs. I'm assuming he wrote this portion about discipline. Well, Solomon knew about discipline, knew about being disciplined. I don't know when he wrote this precisely, but very fitting that it should come from Solomon himself. If you are left without discipline, in which we have all participated, we all experience discipline, all those in the people of God, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. He's saying if you don't have discipline, then God isn't paying attention to you. He, God, disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. Okay? Super important, obviously. If you're Solomon, if we're Solomon, when we are Solomon and we're experiencing discipline of God, it can feel like God's abandoned us. We can get angry. Remember, God disciplines his people for our good so that we may share in his holiness. It's a purification. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And it seems evident, I think, in the scriptural account, the whole Bible, that we need discipline in order to produce this fruit of righteousness. We're not naturally going to go that way. I think that's the end. So next video, we will look at Jeroboam and see how the kingdom was rended in the middle, or from within, not from external people. And we'll continue with that story there.